Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome. And welcome to everyone on the stream as well. We might have a bunch of people there as well. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the dScience Lunch Seminar in the Science Library. So, in the dScience Lunch Seminar series, that is once a month here at the Science Library. And also, the rest of the weeks, we will be in the dScience Lounge, which is just down there. So you can find out more about that on the web. In this lunch seminar series, we invite you to join us for lunch, free lunch, and interesting talks, like today. And dScience is a quick thing about dScience. It's an interdisciplinary center that develops and supports research within computational and data science across UIO, and together with partners in industry and public sector. And in order to do this, we focus on community services like today, creating networks and meeting places. And we have the dScience Partner Program connecting research at UIO with industry and public sector. And we also have a data science analytics group that helps to integrate data science in research projects. And we do also research and project development, which includes various funding initiatives, including the DS Train program that are now hiring 36 postdocs, already hired 18 postdocs. I'm looking around if I can see some of them here, but if you are here, welcome. So you can find more information about dScience on our website. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, and please also subscribe to our newsletter. Okay, today we are very happy to introduce Magnus Li and Alexander Kempton from Information Systems at the Department of Informatics at the University of Oslo. They will explain why public sector digitalization often falls short. They will discuss how viewing digitalization as just a technical issue leads to failed IT projects and offer new ways to approach the complex challenges of organizational improvement. Both speakers bring extensive experience in public sector digitalization. And the title of their talk today is Why is Public Sector I struggle with that word. Public sector digitalization so difficult. And today we have a very good example. If you have been watching the Norwegian news, the Norwegian, I think it's Norwegian Audit Organization or Riksrevisoren, have basically butchered the new health platform. I'm sure you guys are going to be saying something about that. So yeah, without any more, please go ahead. Welcome.
Thanks. So, why is public sector digitalization so difficult? It's kind of a huge question, right? It's a big question. And the reason why we ask it is that we ourselves do research on digitalization in the sector. I mean, that's our work. And as part of this work, we talk with a lot of people and we listen to a lot of talks by people in the sector itself, so kind of practitioners. And of course with colleagues and students and so forth about this topic. And I think what is striking about both these talks and the discussions we have is that they are often framed in two very, very different ways. So, on the one side, one framing is kind of starts in digital innovation. And we see fantastic digital innovation going on nowadays, right? Within AI, within use of data, and all the possibilities that it has for the sector, and also other kinds of innovations. For instance, I've been doing a lot of research within healthcare, and then we see how new types of sensors creates new types of data which can be used in new types of healthcare models. So it's an exciting time in terms of digital innovation and its possibilities for service delivery and governance in this sector. But then, on the other hand, we have a much more kind of pessimistic view of digitalization in the sector. And I'm sorry for the English-speaking people here that I used Norwegian headlines, but they're all basically describing, kind of catastrophes in public sector digitalization projects. So, for instance, this one here, everything NAV has done has been a fiasco, which is kind of the hardest headline I could find. And of course, in terms of digitalization, it's been used billions on consultants, and that's an endless cry for help. Helseplattformen, the health platform, which is the main electronic patent record system in Helse Midt, which is the middle region of Norway, and which has been mentioned. It's been this report today. It here says can give 835 million kroner in extra cost. But what I read on the news today was that they said, well, it's costed some billions, and many practitioners want to scrap it, right? So it might be even a bigger problem. So these are issues related to huge cost overruns, which we see quite often. But there's also many other problems in terms of lack of user experience. So users are often quite unhappy about the systems they use. We see that especially in healthcare, but also in other places in the sector. And we often see a lack of realization of expected benefits. Right? So we expect something beneficial, both in terms of economics and in terms of better service and so forth, should come out of these projects, and then often we see that that doesn't happen. And of course, we could hope that the story of digital innovation is for now and the future, and this other is from the past. But sadly, it doesn't seem to be that way. So we looked at this case, this announcement here, which is a couple of months old, where the digitalization director of Norway, Frode Danielsen, and you see his head here on the slide, he said that 9 out of 10 digitalization projects in the public sector have problems with getting out expected benefits. So it's quite dismal reading, I think. So the question, of course, and what kind of sparks our interest in asking this question is, why does this happen? Why with all these fantastic innovations, why don't we see more benefits in these kind of projects? And there are some very relevant insights here, and the general auditor of Norway, Riksrevisjonen, was mentioned. They have many very insightful reports on failed digitalization projects. We'll mention some of them as we go. And they often point out things like lack of user involvement, and that's what leads to bad user experiences. But we're wondering if there's something more kind of fundamentally problematic about this, in the sense that even though you had more user involvement, we would still see some of the same problems.
Yes. So what we're asking is, are there something more related to our kind of fundamental understanding that underlies how we organize these projects that leads us into kind of the same issues as also illustrated today by Riksrevisjonen over and over. So if you look a little bit at how digitalization often is organized in these kind of big projects, it resembles the way we also organize things related to kind of general product development and delivery. So we have some kind of a technical problem, like we need a tool to collect and analyze data. Then we are asking an internal IT department or some external IT consultants to deliver something per requirement to address that problem. And this can happen either as a kind of slow, once and for all process, a plan-driven type of process, or it can have agility, which is now becoming more and more common. And this process is very similar to the ones that we use also in other types of industries. So for instance, when we are building buildings, of course, we are ordering, for instance, rebar from someone who specializes in building rebar. And then we implement that rebar to build a concrete floor, for instance. And then there are, of course, multiple layers of this. So when you build a new life science building, for instance, this will be very low down in the kind of chain of delivery and production, right? And of course, this model is very, very good in coordination. So we typically would say that this is kind of a loosely coupled relationship, meaning that the people that are interested in concrete stuff, they don't have to be kind of heavily involved in how do we build the rebar. So they can be kind of working detached from each other. Vice versa, those that are interested in building rebar and building the rebar, they don't have to be accountable to what happens when you put that rebar into the concrete as long as it follows the specifications, right? So then you're able to achieve very, very big things by kind of putting it into smaller and smaller pieces of technical problem solving. And interestingly, this is also similar in most of these IT projects, right? So you have the point is, of course, not to build just a tool. The point of the project is to address some higher level problem like we are poor at resource planning, for instance. And then similarly here, we also typically have this kind of division between those two sides. So those that are building the software to address the technical problem, they are not really necessarily connected to what is happening on this side, and vice versa. Yes.
So we think of this way of thinking as kind of a product-based or product-centric way of organizing. So we're thinking, how does this understanding, how does it impact how we think about digitalization processes and projects? Well, we try to point out 4 kind of problematic ways of approaching digitalization and thinking about it, but we kind of think as symptoms of this way of thinking. The first one is that digitalization often becomes a goal in itself. And that's not strange, because we had this focus for decades, really, that we should digitalize more in the sector. We want more digitalized service delivery and governance and so forth. And if you look at the last few years, so I said I work in health, and we see it, in last year there was this Health Personnel Commission. And the Health Personnel Commission said, well, we know that there's demographic changes, more older people, and so forth. We have less resources. We need to digitalize, right, to meet this gap between resources and needs. And then this year, a new health strategy was launched from the government, and they kind of say the same thing. And then there was a digitalization strategy which goes cross domains, which was just released from the government a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at the kind of concrete goals in that strategy, it's very much about increasing the volume of digitalization in the sector. Of course, is a more digital society or more digital organizations, are those goals in themselves? I think that no one who works with this would say that. Of course it's not. And I guess no one here would say it, because what we want is to have better task performance, we want better coordination, we want better information sharing, and so forth. But even though we all agree, it often becomes a goal in itself. And we see this in projects that we have studied and observed, where you kind of start out with saying, okay, we want to solve some organizational problem. But then the project ends up being a project that implements some product, some system, either by developing it itself or more usually through procurement. So they implement the system, they do maybe some training, and then the project is finished. And the problem with that is that you often become what you kind of measure as a success, because if you measure as your success that you've implemented the system, then that's also how you organize the project, right? And I think quite a telling example of this is from one of these Auditor General Riksrevisjon reports, not on the Helseplattformen, but on clinical curve systems, which have been implemented in different regions of Norway the last since 2010 or something. And what Riksrevisjon found out is that one has used kind of immense resources in procuring these systems and implementing them, but then no one has taken control over the overall routine development and routine control. Right? And routines is about how you work and also how you work with these systems. And the consequence of that, according to Riksrevisjonen, is that people have worked with these systems very differently in different units, in different hospitals, and so forth. So we expected to have benefits in terms of more information sharing, better coordination, etc. But then those benefits were not realized because the routines were not in place. So I think that is quite a telling example, because it shows that the project was about implementing some training, and then the kind of routine development and routine management was something that was supposed to come afterwards, and no one then took control over it. That's the first problem. The second one is the belief that better planning and governance should result in better digitalization. And it's not, this is often a critique, that there's a lack of governance, there's a lack of planning. It's not strange, because in other engineering disciplines, planning is key. We were kind of joking that let's say that Fornebubanen was, the new metro line from the center out to Fornebu was plan through a purely iterative way, it would be a very strange Fornebubane you would get, right? And a strange metro line. So in other engineering disciplines, it's key, but maybe not so in digitalization. Maybe the problem is too much planning and too much long-term planning, because both these technologies that are implementing and the organizations that are being changed are they're in continuous change. They're not static entities. These are things that change over time. And that means that if you do long-term and detailed planning, you'll end up with a map that really doesn't fit the terrain at the end. Now, of course, people like me, as a previous software engineer, will say that, of course, we've been thinking about agility for a very long time. It's all about iterations instead of planning, right? That's kind of a key message. And that's also in this Helseplattform report that just came out. That's one of the critiques from Riksrevisjonen. They say that you should have known in 2016 that this type of long-term planning will not work. You should think big but start small. That's what it says in the report. So one should have known already from the start, and even Helsedepartementet, the Ministry of Health, should have stopped the project because of this lack of iterative approach. But even though we've been saying this, we see that agile processes are typically used on kind of solutions close to the user, so it's all about user experience, and then they become details on this much more larger projects. And these larger projects, they have to follow the project model where you start with an idea phase and a concept phase and a planning phase and implementation phase, where each phase plans for the next phase. And of course, there are all kind of budgetary constraints and procurement processes and political processes that might change over time as this digitalization process goes on. So you kind of end up something which we all think should be agile, you end up placing it into these much larger processes. The third symptom or problematic way of thinking is the belief that one large system can meet all kinds of different user needs, as well as flow of information. And this has been also one of these main critique points, which we see kind of repeated, and also we see in newer strategies that this is warned against. But it's not strange that we try to make these big systems, because if you look at the kind of landscape of digital systems in the sector, it's this patchwork, right? Some old systems, some new, and they're all kind of the consequences of kind of contingent decisions made throughout the last 40 years, right, of municipal and governmental history. So you have a patchwork, and they're typically not very interoperable, these systems. So we think, okay, if we can have one big system, we can get better flow of information, and we can get economies of scale. Right? It's a very kind of intuitive way of approaching this problem. But the problem is that in organizations, there's often a much more variation of how people work and the kind of information needs they have, both within the organization and across organizations, than we think from the start. So you go into it and say, oh, people actually work really differently, and they have different types of expertise, and those expertise needs different types of information. And of course, it's something we especially see within healthcare, where there is these very many different types of expertise and ways of working. And that means that when you want to make one big system to meet all these needs, you have to make a lot of compromises. And you often end up making so many compromises that you end up with a system that's not optimal for anyone. And here, Helseplattformen is a very good example. And many of you probably see in this example, there was, I think it was a VG thing of a doctor have to click 36 times to prescribe paracetamol. And it's a good example because it's kind of, wow, with 36 clicks, right, to do it. And then some of the critique has been said, well, okay, this is lack of user involvement. But we're not sure if user involvement would fix this. Because, I mean, you don't really need user involvement to understand that you shouldn't have 36 clicks to prescribe paracetamol. We think this is a result of kind of necessary compromises, because when you try to standardize across many different groups of work practices, it means that you have to make all these compromises, and then you have each working practice have to kind of translate their way of working into the way of the working of the system. So the cost is on the user instead of the system. Last problem is the belief that more generic, off-the-shelf software is the solution, or a simple solution. It's not strange that we believe in off-the-shelf software. I mean, we all use it personally all the time, right? All organizations have to use it. You wouldn't want to, I don't know, develop Microsoft Teams from scratch in every organization. It would be a very strange proposition. But we think there's maybe a lack of awareness of the cost that is related to implementing these generic systems. Because you often end up, in a situation where the system does not fit perfectly well with what we want to use it for and the way we work. And that means that you end up with kind of 3 different options. Either you have to kind of follow the system logic and you have to change the organization, or you have to follow the organization logic and change the system, through customizations. Or more typically, you have to do both. Right? That's why it becomes so costly. And here, we've talked about this point before with people, working in municipalities with IT, and then we get a lot of pushback because they say, well, of course we need to procure. There is no other options. We are not IT companies, right? We shouldn't build our own things. And maybe they're right. I mean, we don't think that everyone should build everything, neither from scratch or kind of finished products. But I think we need some more reflection about, how to procure, what cost it involves, and maybe also how these procured systems are organized, both in terms of markets and in terms of architectures.
Yeah. So, in one way, in many of these projects, we are kind of treating IT as if it was just another kind of building construction type of thing, right? So we are kind of having a construction site, and we're putting the IT into the organization, and then our responsibility is over. And this is what I think emerges from several of these points. And we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what is actually the problem here. Why is this problematic in this context and not in other contexts, where this type of model works very good? And many of the problems lies in the difference between technical problems on the one side, so the kind of problems we deal with when we want to build strong floors, and the kind of problems we deal with when we want to try to improve an organization. So these technical problems, they are typically relatively stable. Also, the effect when we implement something from kind of one side into the other is also relatively stable. So we know quite well what will happen when we put rebar into this concrete. And there is also an established practice on how do you do it. So if you want strong floors, then you know what kind of rebar you need for certain types of specifications and so on. So it's a very stable thing. And of course, this is also related to, as Alexander says, we have all this very good technology. Well, that's because we are very good at solving those kind of problems, super kind of specified problems. Whereas on the other hand here, with these organizational problems, then we are dealing with a very, very different type of situation. And the problem is typically emerging out of a complex system. So the problem is kind of an emergent property of a lot of things going on at the same time, which causes very different types of issues when you put the technology into that type of a situation. So just 2 kind of problems related to this. One is that the effects of putting the computer systems into the organizational problem is very unpredictable, because of course the behavior is emergent from what is already in the organization and what does this new system bring with it. So it's very hard to predict what will happen. And in many projects, we plan to solve some kind of problem, and then you get the complete opposite effect as what you thought of. So for instance, many standardization initiatives, where you try to standardize through software, they often end up with less standards because people are working around the software in their kind of unique ways, and suddenly it's even harder to know what is actually going on. And there are all these studies that shows this very difficult thing with standardization. And of course, also remember that these processes, when we have kind of pinned down a technical problem, this can go on for decades. So in this Helseplattformen, which is now taking a beating today, they started in 2012. That's when they started to define that this is what we need, kind of. And then you have the first implementation in 2019, I think, where you get some kind of idea of what are the consequences here. And is it really solving the original problem, which is not obvious, right? So we could actually also, one is that we could have the wrong solution, but we could also have the wrong problem. So how do we know that poor resource planning is actually due to lack of data? So some projects I've been working in, we have been working on solving this specific type of technical problem for some time. And then when we implement solutions, we see that people are still not using any data because the problem is actually related to accountability, transparency, over decisions, for instance. That's where the problem is lying. But then we spent 10 years trying to put a lot of technology into the organization to support kind of database decisions. But it doesn't have any effect before we solve a completely different problem, which is related to accountability. So that's maybe where the digital innovation should have happened, rather than on the data supply side, or ideally both. Also, one thing which is interesting is that sometimes this is not explicit at all. So the way this happens is that we have some vague understanding that there is a problem in the organization. Immediately, we just assume that we need some digital tool, and then we spend 10 years working on that. And then we implement it, and then we're done. So there is no we don't even see what the results are, and there are no feedback loops going back to what happened, and should we do something other, or should we just continue what we're doing? So this divide is very problematic in that sense. A second interesting problem emerging for this is that since the arrow very usually go from the organizational side to the technical side, that assumes that innovation usually happens by having a stable problem, and then you find new ways of doing something interesting with that problem. But very often, innovation is going the opposite way. So you have some new type of technology, and then since you're aware of that, you see new problems you can solve in the organization. And of course, if you then divide this process up into two, the people that knows what are things we can do, they are all down here, separated through this technical problem, and are not exposed directly to the actual organizational problem context, where it could lie a lot of other ways of doing things based on the technology. And this should be obvious, I think, from your personal experiences. So when you download Snapchat or Instagram, for instance, it's very seldom that you have first formulated a structured technical problem with needs and everything. So I need to send 10-second long messages. Usually you see the solution, and then you think, this could be useful to me. But of course, this model, especially when there are decades between the cycles here, of course, stops all kinds of movement back and forth in this way. And here are also some interesting examples from the public sector. Now, there are some projects, for instance, I've been running for a long time, and they started before all this large language model stuff emerged. So they have no plans of using any of those technologies, and that's not part of the scope at all, and it's not possible to go back. And it's funded, and to refund it is impossible because of all kinds of rules and regulations. So then you have you put the car with the blind driver, and you're just driving without being aware of anything that is happening around you. Yes, and of course, the primary focus on software development methodologies is on this side. Obvious, right? Because it is about solving more structured problems by developing software. So as Alex mentioned, even agility is often just here, between the technical problem here, and not really checking against what is actually the thing that we're trying to achieve on an organizational level. So what we think is that, and of course there are also developments out in practice around this, that there needs to be a tighter coupling between organizational design, organizational problem solving, and this more technical digitalization work. So digitalization should include both sides in one way, and there should be some a tight coupling between them. But of course, this is difficult, again, because the methods that we are very good at, they are typically geared towards this side, the more structured problem side, whereas here we are very poor, right? We're not good at this at all, and we can see that not just from the digitalization side, but all kinds of social, organizational issues. I saw recently a report on how many organizational change initiatives actually achieve their goal, and I think the number is around 20 to 30%. And digitalization in this sense is organizational change, right? So we're in the same landscape. So the methods are much poorer than what we have for the technical problem solving. And this would explain why we're building moon rockets on one side, and then we're failing on everything related to digitalization of large organizations on the other side. Yes. Fortunately, there are several interesting streams of ideas and theory around how do you actually work better with these dynamic, complex organizational problems. And I will not go through all of them, but there are both old and newer ideas around this. And we will look a little bit at what do they point to in common. And kind of a general take-home message from this is that we need a bit of a different model when we think about how do we actually organize digitalization. And we try to call this systemic cultivation. And I will go a little bit into what we mean about that. So with systemic cultivation, I will just take word by word first. So systemic, that relates to thinking about how things are working as a whole rather than in parts. And in classic technology development, we're very good at reducing problems to parts. That's what we train our students to do all the time. So the first thing you do when you start in a software engineering course with us is to kind of learn how to divide this bigger problem into parts. Then you solve each part, and then you put it back together as a solution. Whereas these organizational problems, they are, of course, interlinked, as I said. The problem is not something you can take apart and then still understand kind of each and every one of them. You need to understand it together. So you need some kind of systemic thinking. And to use one example, which I find interesting, especially in digitalization, where we talk a lot about resistance to change. That's one of the things we blame when digitalization goes wrong. And there are two ways of trying to understand resistance to change. So one would be a kind of analytical approach where we try to understand why does this person hate change. So we kind of zoom in on the part, and then we look at, okay, there might be some psychological traits. There are all kinds of explanations around we are evolutionary rigged to not change. But it's highly questionable when you see how much we changed as a society the last 50 years, I think. So another way to analyze this would be to have a more systemic focus. So what is the system that this person is a part of, and how is the change affecting all these relationships that this person is standing in? So when you look at many of these cases where you get a new IT system in, it very often does not align with all the other types of activities, goals, and aims that this person has in their work situation. So then you can start to understand, rather than saying that, okay, this person is just rigged not to change, there might be very good reasons for, maybe the only reason that the system is still working overall is because this person is kind of balancing between the different parts of the system that they're part of and this new software that is coming into the organization. So a systemic analysis of resistance to change. The other word, cultivation, that highlights kind of a different mode of working with problems that's what we're used to in software development. So as programmers, we're very used to, of course, that we can kind of command the software to do as we wish. Especially if we're good at programming, then we can actually say, okay, just to use a very simple example that we actually know that we were able to get the results we want. So we can say that, okay, we want a heading, we want blah, 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 and then, of course, the computer will give back exactly what we ordered the computer to do. Whereas when working with complex systems, it's very often the case that you get a very different result than what you did. So there is kind of a non-linear behavior where you try the same thing, for instance, 2 times, and you get different results back. And that's, of course, because the system is complex and has a lot of elements that are interacting all the time, and it's impossible to know kind of what will be the result. So cultivation is a word that often is used in gardening, for instance, which is, of course, a complex problem situation where you have a complex system, you have nature, and a hobby of mine is gardening. That's why I'm using this example. And when I started to garden, this was basically the result I got. So I read, okay, you can plant this here in the sun, and it will thrive in the sun. And then I plant it, and then it dies. And then it turns out, okay, there are other elements here that are important. It's all kinds of soil stuff. It's about water. It's about all kinds of things. So the way to learn gardening usually then is to try out. So it's not a good idea to buy 100 plants and then all dies. It's a good idea to start with one plant, and then you see, okay, does it survive, blah, blah, blah. Then you learn a little bit about the soil while you're trying, right? And then you can also look at the result. Okay, this looks nice. Maybe I can put something else on this side, and it will look nicer. So it's a gradual type of work where you kind of work with the complex system in order to get improved results. So this, of course, model will be very different than a typical kind of implement, deliver type of model, where you're working, and I will go a little bit into these letters here, more gradually with trying to cultivate the organizational problem by working more directly with it, rather than having this divide between. So it's kind of an adaptive learning system, rather than a system of producing and delivering software. So I will say a little bit about some of these elements before we round off. How are we on time? 9 more. Okay, then I will be very quick. So I already said a little bit about this. In order to work directly with organizational problems, rather than just solving the technical ones, we need to develop a systemic understanding. And very often, the way this is done in project is to do a lot of mapping and modeling. So you map the system, and you're then not reducing it, but trying to map the relationships between things. So this is kind of one important ingredient in order to understand how are things working, or at least trying to kind of approximate to an understanding of how things are working in the organization. Then what is interesting with organizational problems compared to technical problems is that they can often be framed in very different ways. So the problem of we are poor at resource planning, for instance, could be seen as an issue of lack of tool to collect data, as we already talked about. That could be one way of framing it as a kind of concrete technical problem. And that will shift our attention to certain elements within that situation, right? It will particularly made us look at this kind of relationship between the humans and the computers. If we say that the problem is the usability of the reporting tool is poor, that will even more focus our attention on kind of that relationship. Whereas if we zoom out and we say that and kind of shift our perspective in the system, an equally valid problem could be that managers do not use available data in their planning. And of course, this type of exercise, actually working with what is the problem as a kind of source of trying to examine different perspectives, that's a thing that we're rarely trained at as kind of software development people, because we have these more specified problems. But this will be, of course, a very important ingredient when working with this, especially since all these problems are probably true at the same time, right? So I guess the usability is poor. That's always the case almost with any computer system, at least according to someone. At the same time, I think many managers are not using data. The question then is what problem is the one that, if we solve it, will actually give an effect? Most probably, if we solve the usability reporting tool thing, that will maybe have a little bit of effect. If we try to address the managers are not using the data, that will, of course, point to very, very different types of interventions, which will have more effect. So it requires us to have an explicit awareness and kind of experimentation with how do we frame the problem as a technical problem in which we can build something. Yeah. We also need to have systemic interventions, and interventions that are not just kind of putting the software in there. And I think Alexander's example of this curve system, what did you call it in English? Charting system. Where they said that, okay, we are building the software, and now someone else will take over and do the organizational change stuff after we deliver the software. That would be a typical example of a non-systemic intervention, where you do one part, and then you leave maybe the most important part out of the intervention. Thing that we hear very often is, of course, that our computer solution is simple. It's just about these very, very difficult people that don't want to change their practice. And that might be true, they might be difficult, but if that stops the solution, then it's no solution, right? So you can go all day and say, no, it's them that are stupid, but you don't have a solution if they're not happy, right? Because then it will not be used. Yes. Also, going a little bit back to gardens, if I plant 100 plants, and at the same time, I use a new fertilizer, I water the plants, I chop down some trees to give more sun, at the same time, then it's very difficult to know what caused any of the effects that I'm seeing. And I think this is a big thing in some of these huge IT projects, is of course the solutions are doing so much at the same time, so it's impossible to see what worked and what didn't work. So ideally, in this type of cultivation model, it makes sense to have smaller interventions that is actually possible then to measure. And also in many of these projects, this idea that we can measure the effects after 20 years of development and then implementation, that's a very strange way of working with organizations, I hope you kind of also see. Rather, this measuring of effects should be a kind of a compass in the process, right? So you're trying out something and you have to see, is it giving any effect? Is it giving the opposite effect? And then learn from that. And in that kind of landscape, it also makes sense to have, one thing is to learn that the solution kind of is not doing things optimally, so we need to modify the solution. The other is what we call double loop learning, meaning that you also learn things that challenge the problem in the first place. I had this one example earlier where we worked for several years on trying to improve decision making. Later to find out that the tool we developed didn't have any effect because the problem was wrong. It wasn't, they didn't need a tool. The lack of tool wasn't the problem. The lack of transparency in decision making was the problem. And of course, that is something that can be learned through implementing something, but then that also needs to be part of the scope, which is very rarely in these projects, right? Because when the problem is defined in the beginning, that is stable until the end, and then the project is over. Yes. So what now? So we have presented some problems and some elements of a different approach. But of course, this is difficult, and this is not an easy thing to do. So I think there are some questions, and these are things, of course, we are doing research on, both of us. So one is, how do we cultivate an understanding of digitalization that actually leads to a good way of organizing projects with the right types of stakeholders? That's one very interesting question, since we see that every time, even though the Riksrevisjonen is saying all the time that this is not going on, we still go into this. And I think that's because that product mindset is very deeply rooted in how we understand things. Another is, how do you align this type of cultivation approach with the obvious need of procuring larger solutions? Because that's, of course, completely necessary to have bigger standardized software solutions at the same time that you are able to cultivate. So how do you do that? And also, how do you make these kind of approaches work in the kind of landscape of project management practices that we have in the public sector? Because there are all kinds of things there that are inhibiting that kind of an approach. So yeah, and with that, I think we say thank you.
Thanks.
Very much. This way? Okay, thank you. Okay, guys, any questions? Yes, Cecilia? Or we have one question up here first. Okay, sorry.
Thank you for a very good presentation. One thing that you didn't mention too much is what makes a big difference between industrial projects and IT public projects is that in industrial projects, that's actually a three-part system. In that, you've got standards in the middle, right? When you order rebar, like basically, everybody is relating to standard. That means to standards. That means the ones who are ordering it, the ones who have to use it, the ones who have to produce them, have standards, right? That, of course, doesn't work in an industrial situation where you try to get innovation and a competitive advantage, right? And then you got, in these projects, you got the same sort of problem. But in public systems, right, these are monopolies, right? So they shouldn't have this particular problem. So it could help, I think, quite a lot if we would, if people would adopt a number of standards that you can put in the middle, that everybody can relate to, that they can sort of take into, start using in parallel, right? That would be a very big help, I think.
can also just comment. I think that's true, and I mean you said that the public sector is a monopoly, but of course it's very siloed. So you know, different organizations are very autonomous, and they're all very siloed between different domains. I think standard has the same needs in a way as in industry. But I don't know if it's in incentive structures or what does it, that it's very challenging to get this cross domain standards. There's more a comment than an answer, maybe. Yeah.
Very interesting. A couple of questions. First, have been in touch to the system dynamics environment at the university in Bergen, which is one of the best in Northern Europe. And I'm really happy to see that system thinking is getting into the software development, which traditionally, you mentioned Agile, and everyone is using Agile, but we forget that Agile has been developed based on manufacturing of cars, where actually dividing the problems into smaller problems worked because it was a repetitive process. But working with organization and humans, it has been proved, unfortunately, 20 years later, that is not the best. But it's very interesting. And so if you haven't been in touch with System Dynamics in Bergen, I highly recommend it. The second thing is that it's very interesting to see the relations in the systems, but you haven't analyzed the type of feedback and the importance of feedback that each part gives to the system. And that will be very interesting to evaluate, especially that at the end of the day, everything we do in a system, we do for the end users. So no matter how perfect the system is, if the end user doesn't use it, that means that is a failure of the solution and not the user. And it's very interesting to see from this point of view, and also a question if you have considered the design thinking methods with the deep type of interview, where actually the classical 5 whys, to really get not to what the user tells you, but actually what the user needs. Because I think that we have a lot of examples in the public sector in Norway, total failures or partially failures. But it's very interesting to see how we can make it better, shorter, and much more user-oriented to avoid billions of users, of kronas wasted. So, yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I can, very brief, 2 things. Thanks for the tips with the system dynamics and everything. One on the feedback loop. I think that's a very interesting question, right? What kind of and if any agility, where and how, and where are the feedback loops going, right? Because I think now that the feedback loops are very often going from the evaluating if we are solving a technical problem, rather than seeing is this having the right effect on what we actually care about, right? So we have kind of the feedback loops going in the wrong places, which can create this perverse system where you just kind of develop more and more software without really checking, is this software actually causing any benefits? And it's basically what this Frode Danielsen in the Directorate of Digitalization is saying, right? That we have digitalized for 20 years. Now we want to check if we are on the right or the wrong track, basically, which is a very slow feedback loop, which should be faster, of course, with all this unpredictability. The other is this design thinking. I think there are it's part of the inspirations for some of these principles related to, especially this framing, because I think that's a heavy part of this design thinking stuff, is the asking why to get to different types of framings in order to find problems. So that's an interesting side. Thank you very much for the comments.
Can also just add that there's many, especially municipalities, are buying new or procuring new electronic health record systems now. And some of them are thinking, how can we create procurement processes and contracts where you do get much faster feedback cycles and these kind of things. So that's something we're very curious also to follow out in the sector now, that they're trying out these new ways of thinking in terms of feedback and learning.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, one more here. I think that will be the last question, and then we have to finish.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Hagen. I'm working at the IT department of the University of Oslo. And one aspect that you didn't really mention is the aspect of privatization. I'm going to give one example. The University of Oslo last year decided to go for the Microsoft cloud and privatizing a large part of the things we were doing at the IT department. And what do you think, which role privatization plays? Because, of course, Microsoft isn't looking at us in terms of a socio-technical system, but as a source of money. And apparently the leadership, one of the main reasons to go for Microsoft was that it's very difficult to get consultants for any other solution, completely ignoring that we have 400 employees at the IT department, some of which might be competent enough to run an email server. So I guess the problem goes a little bit deeper than just systems thinking, right?
It's an interesting, and I think it's there are several questions in the same kind of group there. You know, if we're trying to get different types of feedback loops, basically, right, and different types of accountability loops, then what kind of accountability do you place on different actors? For instance, in this Trøndelag health platform case, you know, there is a software provider in the US who delivered this, who I don't think they have any problems, even though everything is going very problematic, right, because they're not looped in on the consequences. But if you shift that kind of accountability, you also have problems in you're kind of shifting all the risk over to the IT providers, right? So it's a bit of an interesting tension there, and I think that's a very interesting area for more research. You know, what in order to get dynamics like we want, who should be responsible for what and how, team compositions, how do you buy in procurement stuff? That's kind of interesting elements.
Yeah, because it's such a complex question. I mean, it's in a way, I do these studies in the municipality of Oslo, and we see that, okay, they do the same. So they use Microsoft Cloud, but because they use Microsoft Cloud services, they can, you know, they also can do more innovation themselves because it's easier than doing other kinds of things. And they get more, you know, it means that they build more, can get more control over parts of their infrastructure in terms of kind of competence, that they know how to do it. At the same time, of course, they're getting kind of path dependent on this one solution. And what is the right way to navigate it? It's at least I can't. It's hard to give a good answer to that now. But I think it's an immensely important and maybe a question which is not investigated enough. Yeah. So thanks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure they can, if you have more questions, I'm sure you can reach out directly to you guys and they will answer you. So thank you very much. One more round of applause. Okay. So before we leave today, I just have to say one thing. You know, next Thursday is Halloween, and at 10:30 across the building, I mean the other building here, Magnus Li, the person who is responsible for the digitalization and public governance of Norway, Karianne Tung, is coming to hold the digitaliseringsforelesningen in Norwegian, also the lecture about the digitalization of Norway. She's coming there next Thursday at 10:30. You don't have to sign up or anything, it's free. So please come, and then you will find out. You can ask questions to her as well. And I'm sure now you have a lot of food for thoughts. So please take that advantage and meet up and ask her some difficult questions. So thank you very much.